Today on the podcast, I'm so excited to bring on my mentor and someone who has become a friend over the past few years. She's here to join us to tell us her story and her experience of having a hysterectomy. This is a conversation that I hope is going to spur some inspiration and just spark a little bit of not aloneness on this journey if you are somebody who is faced with this decision. Once again, when it comes to women's health and these issues where we're being thrown diagnoses and where we're having to make decisions about our reproductive health, about our womb space, about a part of our identity, this is part of our body, it can really feel overwhelming. And sometimes it can feel like we have no one to talk to. So today I have Robyn Birkin joining us to tell us all about her diagnosis, her experience through a hysterectomy, and how she feels on the other side post a few years of having the hysterectomy. Welcome back. I am so excited that you have joined me again in the Aligned Womb, Aligned You podcast. I'm Kate Nagai, and I am your host and womb guide on this journey. I'm here to help you to lean into the language of your menstrual cycle so that you can align yourself and awaken and activate to your womb wisdom, to live the most inspired life. I am so excited to jump into this episode and to dive into today's topic. So let's get started. Well, today we're going to dive into a conversation that I think is one that is needed because I think a lot of women face this. They face this question, they face this dilemma, and to be honest, there's not anyone talking about it. And I want to start to talk about it. I want to start talking about so that women can feel comfortable with the decisions that they're making. So, Robyn, I am so excited to have you on here because I know that you've gone through this and I know that you've been in this post phase for a while now, and you have a beautiful relationship with your body, even though this happened. So, without giving anyone little hints here, I would love for you to tell a little bit about your story and your journey.
Sure. So we started trying to conceive, let's just dive a little bit further back. My husband and I are high school sweethearts. We were together a long time, checked all the boxes, buy a house, have the careers. We literally did a round the world trip. And then I turned 30 and we started trying to conceive. And I was this type of woman who, like, fully into my career, I used to take the pill and skip, like, continue taking it without those, like, the filler ones in the middle. And I would skip my period for like 6 to 12 months at a time. I was that person. I did not understand about my body. But then we started trying to conceive, and I very much view myself as mainstream, but woo-woo open. And a bit of a type A, I decided to go and see a naturopath for a preconception plan. And holy dooly, there was a lot I didn't know about my body. That, rapid education. All of a sudden, here I am charting my cycles. I don't think I even knew what ovulation was. That's the level of maybe inattention that I had at school, or did they even teach me that? And I was convinced that we would conceive straight away. I was like, literally, I've ticked the boxes. I've taken the supplements. I'm a healthy person. I exercise regularly. And the spoiler alert is that it didn't happen. And even my naturopath was a bit confused by it. She's like, oh, well, like, we've done all the things and, you've got really great levels of everything. And it became a 2.5-year journey of trying to conceive. I credit our specialist to not being the type of person to continue doing the same thing for a long period of time without getting results. And I feel like people are in kind of two camps. There's the people who are resistant to fertility clinics, and the people who are like, get me in yesterday, let's throw everything at it. I was the second group. I was like, whatever you got to do, I'm in. And so we went through really like 2 ovulation inductions, 2 IUIs, which ended up being 3 because I had too many follicles. And in Australia, they're very strict about not allowing you to have too many follicles. And then we ended up doing IVF. My first cycle, I hyperstimulated quite badly, which basically means that like they're pumping you with so many hormones, it's not funny. And I kind of just blindly went along with it. I was like, whatever's just going to get me pregnant as soon as possible. And I was like, whatever, but I hyperstimulated quite badly. So that's where kind of like there's too much medications, the cycle medications or the type of way that they've given you the particular hormones to make all of these, eggs has messed up your body a little bit, and your ovaries end up stretching too much kind of thing, because then all of a sudden they suck them out and you just get free flowing fluid that goes into your ovaries and just goes into your abdominal cavity. And I was quite a tiny person at the time. So I weighed about 54 kilograms, and I don't know what that is in pounds. It's not a lot. And then I ended up with 7 kilos of additional fluid around my abdomen. I was nearly admitted into hospital, but I was pretty resistant to doing that. I was severely dehydrated, even though there was all this fluid in my body. My stomach was right up like near my heart when they did the ultrasound, because there was just no room in there. But I was pregnant. And I was overjoyed, and this is amazing. And then they told me that the pregnancy wasn't viable 2 days before the heartbeat. So I was gutted at that time. And it led me on this journey to really evaluate the way that I was thinking, feeling, dealing with my mental health. I was, like this career woman through and through. I would push down my feelings. I had such masculine energy that this kind of stopped me in my tracks to say, hang on, like I crumbled at that point, and led me on the journey to becoming a certified life coach and mind body practitioner, launching a podcast all about, I guess, sort of emotional well-being for women navigating infertility and trying to conceive. I then got pregnant shortly after. I had to do another retrieval. I got pregnant with my daughter, Chloe. And then they were like, get back in the clinic as soon as you can, because you're, coming up to geriatric maternal age, which actually isn't that old. Yep. I was like 34. Yeah. But they were like, get back in the clinic as soon as you've had 2 cycles, get back into the clinic and let's go again. And so, when Chloe was just barely, not even a year and a half, we went again, and I fell pregnant with Olivia from the very last frozen embryo that we had. And that was where it all got interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have something like infertility, you have this kind of mindset that surely I've been through the hardship of everything. Like surely it's all going to come up roses from here. And honestly, like that's just not always the case. So I loved being pregnant. I was one of those women who just I glowed in pregnancy, and everything was fine. When I had Chloe, I did hypnobirthing and all of this stuff. And I literally ended up, I was shaking so badly, I couldn't stand up and I was vomiting everywhere. And so I ended up with an epidural with Chloe. I decided with Olivia, I was just going to walk backwards into the clinic with a target on my back. I was like, that's fine. I didn't even need to make that choice though, of whether or not to have an epidural, because at 20 weeks at my scan, the ultrasound tech was like, slight problem. You'll be having a C-section. And I was like, sorry, what? And I had Chloe vaginally. So I didn't even think, hadn't even crossed my mind. I was like, what do you mean I'll be having a C-section? She's like, yeah, you're probably just going to need to be kept a close eye on, because your placenta has implanted right over your cervix. So what we don't understand about the placenta, and I'm a big placenta girl. I don't know why, I've got big placentas, both of my children. But what your placenta actually does is it implants, I don't know if it's arteries or veins. It actually grows little arteries or veins into your uterus. So it's stuck there. So it was almost like it was dead center. So baby can't come out. Like, as much as people are like, oh no, like, is there a way? I'm like, there's literally no way. Like, how can a baby punch through the placenta? And she kind of didn't really tell me much about it. Yeah, just talk to your doctor, but there could be a chance, and there could be a chance that you'll be delivering early and going from there. I was like, hang on, what? So next meeting with my obstetrician, of course, I got home and Googled everything, horror stories
Mm-hmm.
of placenta previa. Turns out I had grade 4 major placenta previa. It was dead center of my cervix. So sometimes people have it a little bit to the side, and then when your tummy grows, it kind of grows out of the way. No way. Mine was dead center. And honestly, it was just like a lot of horror stories, a lot of women who were, because as your stomach grows, if you've implanted all of these like little arteries or veins into your womb, as you grow, it stands to reason that some of those might, like kind of, I guess, like pop out. And so there would be women who would be constantly in and out of hospital through their entire pregnancies with bleeding. A lot of horror stories. And I was like, crap. But was also, I guess, like credited with having this training as a life coach, and then having dedicated the last couple of years to navigating healthy ways to emotionally cope through the unknown and uncertainty. So I managed to go through my entire pregnancy without a bleed until, but we got to 32 weeks, and all of a sudden it got really real. I was told you cannot travel more than 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes drive away from the hospital now until you give birth. We're going to book you in for 38 weeks for your cesarean early, because we don't want you to need an emergency cesarean. And you can, if you look up the statistics, you can bleed out from placenta previa in like 10 minutes. Like, it's just pretty bad. And there's a 90% chance of prepartum hemorrhage. So it's like disaster stats. Again, I added into these Facebook groups, and I was like, horror stories. We got to 32 weeks. I had steroid injections. I had a big conversation, and we went through, and she was like, look, this is what's going to happen. And I said, what are the chances of, for example, like needing a hysterectomy? And she was like, look, they're very low, but even if it's 1 to 10%, if you're the person that's in the 1 to 10%, then it's you. Like, so don't look at percentages, just know that it's a possibility. I was like, okay. And she was like, but before we get to that, there's like 7 other things that we do. We do this medication, then we do a Buckree balloon, then we do this, this, this. And so I kind of knew this, like almost like a ladder of 7 steps until they get there. So I go about my day. And again, I'm just so grateful that I knew how to cope through uncertain situations. I prepared a bag for the hospital that sat at my front door. I organized for my neighbor. I was like, just in case there's a bleed. And she had a young daughter the same age as Chloe. I was like, do you reckon that, you could help in this situation? Maybe look after Chloe, do this, this. She was like, sure, that's fine. And I was 37 weeks to the day, and I had a friend around for coffee. And I remember the times like just so vividly. My friend left coffee at about 2:30 p.m. And it was about maybe 3:30 p.m. And we have a sunken lounge. I walked up the step in the sunken lounge, and I was like, oh, did I just wee a little bit, or was that blood? And I had to wear a pad 24/7 now. The hospital had asked me to. And so I went to the toilet, and I was like, oh, it's happened. I'm having a prepartum hemorrhage. So I had already messaged my friend who lived across the road to say we're going to come over for a play date. I called her, and I was like, Bhavna, change of plans. I'm going to walk Chloe over to your house. I need you to drive me to the hospital. So Bhavna, like, one of my angels in life. So I literally walked across the street. It was Chloe's little best friend, Tanaya. Chloe just walked through the door like she owned their house. And she was lucky because she was also about to have her second child as well. So her parents had come from Kenya to stay with her for a while. Chloe walked in like she owned the joint, and Bhavna just walked out. And I had a towel on the seat. She just drove me straight to the hospital. That was how fast it was. I called Ross on the way to the hospital, and my husband was working at the time. He would always work about an hour and a half away, and he was on a building site, like up the top of a scaffold. So I called him, and I was like, on the way to the hospital. Oh no, yeah, I think he didn't answer at first, and then I called his dad. I was like, he's going to need to call me. His dad freaks out and then like runs over to him at the building site. And Ross was like, what's going on? I was like, so I'm bleeding. Bhavna's just taking me to the hospital. It's all fine. They'll probably give me some magnesium and hold me overnight. Hold me overnight. I'll be back soon. But if you could, pop away from the building site for a moment, that'd be great. So he's got a trailer. He's got all his equipment out. So he's like, crap. So he's like, everybody off site, pack up. Drives like the hour. He obviously needs to have a shower because he can't rock up on site covered in concrete. But meanwhile, I'm on the 10-minute drive to hospital with Bhavna. On the car, she's like, so I'll just come in with you. I was like, no, just drop me at the door. I'll be fine. As we get like 2 minutes later, I'm like, actually, could you just park in the 30-minute parking? And then she's like, sure, look, I'm here for you, whatever. Well, and every step I took was this sound. Sorry if this is too much information. It was like another, you could feel the squirts of blood, right? And the bleeding triggered contractions. The contractions were triggering more bleeding. So all of a sudden, in the space of, so this was about 3:30 that I started bleeding. Called her instantly on the way, like 10 minutes down the road to the hospital. They were waiting for me at the entrance of the hospital with a wheelchair. And I was like, oh, this is just getting a little bit more serious. Wheel me straight to the maternity ward. The nurse was like, you and me straight into the toilets, show me your pad. She was like, cool, fine. Put on a hospital gown. Instantly, everybody's in the room, like chaos. And I just kind of said, Bhavna, actually, could you just stay for a little while? And I didn't have the time to call Ross because I was instantly transported into the birthing suite. And that they were like, well, we can't really wait for Ross. Like, we're going to do our best, right? So I was just like, hi, okie dokie. And so Bhavna's just waiting there. We just thought, like, initially we thought when we were driving to the hospital that this was just going to be like, you'll admit me for the night, give me some magnesium to, stop the contractions, we'll all be fine. But it had just progressed. And Aviva Grace Birkin was born at 4:14. That's how quick. Wow. So Ross's version of events is obviously very different. But so I'm in the room. I gave birth by myself. I know so many women during COVID were like, I'm really sad because my husband couldn't be in the room. Honestly, it was great. It was so calm in that room. He's not really a blood person. When I gave birth to Chloe, he was barely holding on, but I was like, cool, I've got this. It was very quiet, very calm. How great are anaesthetists? Like, they just bring the personality, don't they? And so they were cool. They were chatting through it. Olivia was born. And then the next thing, I start, this ladder of all of the things that my obstetrician had been speaking about, just these like trigger words I start hearing her say. And so all of a sudden I hear her say something like, no, we can't do a back crew balloon because of blah, 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 blah. We've already given the medication. We can't give any more. And I was like, oh, hearing all of these things happening. And then the next thing is she looks at me and she's like, yo, Robyn, we're going to need to give you a hysterectomy. And I had heard her on the phone as well to the director of obstetrics at the hospital. And she was like, we're going to need to give you a hysterectomy. And I just remember this moment of the anaesthetist kind of rushing in between us and looking at me and saying, sorry, Do you understand what she's saying? That's major. It's a hysterectomy. And in my mind, I was like, she was like, Robyn, I've been massaging your uterus on top of your stomach for 30 minutes manually. We've given you that. And I was like, I knew because number one, I had prepared that that was a possibility, but also I heard her. And I'm so glad we had that conversation because I could hear it getting to that point. So she was like, we're going to need to give you a hysterectomy. And I think in these birth situations that so often we can get into these situations where we're like, hang on, like I need to save it, and looking back, did I really understand completely what a hysterectomy meant? Like I didn't know that your uterus is like kind of like the bungee has bungee cord holding up all of your other internal organs. I didn't know any of that, but I also knew that there wasn't really an option. So I could sit and grieve with it, or I could be really at peace with she's been through the steps. She's not just rushing towards this. She's manually sat there massaging it to try and get it to contract for 30 minutes, and I'm already losing blood. So I had lost by this point 50% of the blood in my body. And they were like, we're going to put you under. And like that was that. So landed in critical care for 2 nights. The thing I'm most sad about probably is Olivia went downhill as well, and she ended up 5 nights in the special care nursery. And like I'm sad about that because I was also bedridden. I couldn't just walk up to see her. So I grieve that, but I feel very much at peace with having had a hysterectomy. And I know that there are so many women who feel deeply traumatized and really deeply grieve that. And that really wasn't my experience.
Yeah. And how old were you when you had your hysterectomy?
35.
35. So that's really young. And I know for a lot of women, they get concerned about, okay, so I've had this hysterectomy at 35. What does this mean for my hormone health going forward in the future?
Yeah.
And I think this is a lot of like what you're saying is like how you talked with your physician and were able to like understand the steps that might be happening so that you're aware. I think that's the key to helping so many women come to terms with this hard decision sometimes. I've had
Yeah.
clients that have had to have a hysterectomy because of fibroids,
Mm.
cancer, you with your birth story. There's a multitude of reasons why we might have to have them. And I think, and once again, like I do not have a hysterectomy and I'm not a physician, but I think that for sometimes, I think sometimes there are these situations where hysterectomies, it's just an easy protocol, right? It's just like this will solve
Agreed.
this problem. But there's
Yes.
conditions like with cancer, like with your situation, with like some of the fibroid issues out there that this this is this is the right choice. This is a
Mm-hmm.
choice that's because for your health, for your well-being, this needs to happen. Um, but I think, again, what I really appreciate about your story is that you had the right person to walk you through that choice, right? So that even though it really wasn't a choice you had, it was like, this is happening, you still felt like you were part of the process.
Exactly. And I think, I think back to myself, when we grow up, when we're like 16, 17, when no one's given us a really great education of like, if I could have my period, even though, I guess using whatever people use these days, I guess can be inconvenient in some ways. If I could choose to have my period, 100% I would. Like the clues that it gives you is incredible. But, there wasn't a choice in the matter. And 100% people, I think sometimes people think it's a really easy solution for different things, but also sometimes it is really necessary
Hmm.
to keep us alive, to keep us out of significant and enduring pain. So, yeah, it
Yeah.
just is. And I think asking questions and having a really good relationship with your, the physician that is supporting you can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And, also credit to myself that didn't feel like I had to be rushed. I didn't have white coat syndrome around her. I had been at fertility clinics. I was in the space of being able to advocate for myself and ask all of the questions and not feel like I needed to rush out of her office. So it was me who was saying, well, talk to me about this. Talk to me about the options. Talk to me about what happens, in this scenario. And she had the, grace to be able to sit and really in-depth answer all my questions and help me feel prepared. I feel so lucky that I had that conversation.
Mm-hmm. I was at an event this weekend and we had a physician talking there as our keynote speaker around women's health. And one thing that she said that I thought was so helpful was that if something is like glaring or you feel it in your body, you just know your body and you know something's off and you go in and say, listen, this is happening to me. If you feel like they are rushing you out or that they're not listening, you have two choices. Demand they listen or walk, right? And I think sometimes as women, we really need to hear that if we don't have a practitioner or a person who's caring for us that is willing to engage in those hard questions and to be that sounding board and to give us the time, especially when it comes to these big decisions, then
Mm.
we either say, hold up, you need to listen to me and take me seriously, or we need to give ourselves permission to say, this is not the right physician for me. I will go find another and I'll ask my same questions and I will get the answers I need so I can make the right decision for me. We should never feel like we have to do something unless if it's life threatening. We should never have
Mm.
to do something on the fly. I remember with all three of my births, I had a midwife, and she always said, because I had three very different deliveries, and one was to a baby that was 31 weeks old. And her words to me as soon as Quinn was born was, unless if it's life-threatening, you do not need to make a decision right away. And so, like, I think that is the advice that we have to go with is that sometimes this information, it's hard to hear, it's hard to digest, and it doesn't help with Dr. Google, but we need to find a practitioner that will hear our concerns and then will go through those questions with us to make us feel like we have the answers.
Yeah, and there's two things that I always advocate for, especially having worked with so many women who are navigating complex infertility journeys. One of them is, and I live by this mantra for medical things, be the squeaky wheel.
Mhm.
Like, just always be the squeaky wheel. Ask the questions. Make sure that you feel really confident and calm with the answers and know that they don't always have all of the answers, but think of them, they get paid well for what they do. You're a customer. So they are not like gods or anything like that. They are really highly skilled people, but they're not gods. And this is your body, your life. It's really important. So you're the customer. So be the squeaky wheel. And the other thing that I say is never be afraid to get a second opinion. If you even have the inkling of getting a second opinion, just go get it. And I want to really honor that sometimes it does take strength
Mhm.
to continue fighting. If you've been to like 4 different people and regardless of whether they're giving the same answer or a different answer, to just feel like when you're being dismissed, you need to keep asking and asking and asking. But on the same token, like if you even have an inkling, like only a couple of things are going to happen. They're going to confirm that your original primary doctor like is the same and reaffirm the right decision, or they're going to tell you something different, which could be helpful information for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree 100%. So there's two things that have kind of come up in this conversation that I'd love to ask you. And the first is that you had mentioned that through your work as a life coach and doing the work that you had been doing on your fertility journey, that you had tools that you felt were helpful for you to cope with uncertainty. Would you
Yes.
mind sharing some of these tools for anyone that might be in this place of, and not necessarily with a hysterectomy, but just playing in this place of uncertainty about their health, about their wellness, about a big decision that they have to make. What could they call upon?
Yeah. So one of my favorite tools is, I wouldn't even call it like an active practice, but it's being able to understand your brain and the way that your brain works. And what I love about this is, so, I love meditation and mindfulness as well, but it's really an active practice.
Mhm.
Metacognition, or understanding your brain and the way that your brain works, is like, once you know, and there's nothing more that you have to do. So I kind of have this, and I have all these really quirky and weird mantras, but one of my mantras is like, don't panic until you need to panic, right? Because what we do is sometimes we put ourselves through situations twice, because like once because we're sitting and worrying about it, which may or may not happen, but then also when or if it actually happens. And then half the time we're going to worry about things that are actually never going to happen. So I'm always like, you know what? And through, having this placenta previa, 32 weeks, I've gone into the doctor's clinic. They're like, wear a pad all the time. Don't go more than 10 minutes from the clinic. Here's a steroid injection in case your baby comes early. This is the protocol for when you have a bleed. And by the way, there's a 90% chance that's going to happen, right? Like, serious. Oh, and then she was like, this is when we're going to schedule you in, because I need an A team for this surgery. I don't want like any like average players. So you come out of that meeting at 32 weeks and you're like, oh, Nelly, this sounds very serious. And so I could have spent, it was designed, I was meant to go in for my planned C-section at 38 weeks. It ended up being 37 weeks on the dot. So I had 5 weeks then when I could have sat in like being really paranoid, and that's not to say like I went to the toilet and didn't check for blood every time, but I had 2 choices of how I was going to handle this: panic now when I actually literally have no idea what's going to happen, or just continue to wait and see how this plays out until the very, very last minute. And I lived this philosophy through my whole life, like, don't panic until you need to panic. And what we need to understand about that is that the way that our brains work, they're literally designed to always be considering and thinking about the worst case scenario.
Mhm.
If we're in caveman times and I'm like walking along I've got hippy dippy Sarah and myself walking along, and I'm like worry wart Robyn, right, with hippy dippy Sarah. If we're walking along and all of a sudden, like, I'm always hyper alert. I'm like, oh my God, is that a mountain lion? Run! 999 times out of 1,000, I will be wrong. Like, it's literally just a bush and I was confused, but I ran, I worried for nothing. But one time out of 1,000, it was a mountain lion, right? And hippy dippy Sarah was always like, nah, it's a bush. Well, she got eaten and I didn't. And you don't know which time out of that 1,000 it's going to be a mountain lion, right? So she wouldn't live to reproductive age, but I would. And the difference is that now, we're not being chased by mountain lions. Like, we're stuck in peak hour traffic. And granted, the condition I had could have been life-threatening, which doesn't mean I can't prepare and be educated, but it just means that, I've done what I can do. I've prepared a bag. I've spoken to my neighbor about driving myself to hospital. I'm taking the precautions. That's like, what more do you want me to do? I'm going to live my life. But 80% of the thoughts that we have in our brains are negative thoughts. They're all like the worst case scenario. What's going to go wrong here? That, we have a great day at work. Everything's really great, except we sent this one email that like pissed someone off, and then we just sit on that one email. We can't, it's sticky in our brains. But 95% of the thoughts we have, exact same thoughts as yesterday, right? Then for, what is it, like 85% of the negative worst case scenario thoughts that we have never eventuate.
Isn't that
And for
crazy?
70, sorry?
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And then for 79% of the people for whom it didn't eventuate, so that's 15% of people it eventuated, for 79% of that 15%, they reported that the worst case scenario was an anticlimax, like it wasn't as bad as what they were stressing over. So you have this choice. Once you understand the stats like that, 95, my brain is designed to be thinking that way. That doesn't mean like, I have to take everything as life and death in this scenario. 95% of my thoughts are the same thoughts as yesterday. Like it's a broken record, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can worry about the worst case scenario, but it's highly likely it's not going to come true. And it's also highly likely that, like the big alarm bells sounding in my brain about what that's going to feel like, it's actually not going to be as bad. So when you understand things like that, you can come into, I guess, like life with a much more rational, even keel way of thinking, feeling, coping through life, right? So I'm always like, we have our thoughts that then start to create the feelings that we have, that then lead to the behaviors we take. And then that leads to our experience of life. And I find that so much of what we do, people are like, meditate, exercise, do this, do that. So much of that is based on addressing the feelings that we have. But I'm like, no, like go up and start, reframing the thoughts, because if you're not as affected by the thoughts you have, that then flows on to not even like being able to be much more even keel and not having those feelings. So a lot of what I've focused on learning in terms of the way that I think, feel, deal, cope through life is based on just understanding thoughts and how they work.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Now, the other question I wanted to ask you as well, because even though you knew that this was a possibility, once it happened, once you've had the hysterectomy, you're recovering, was there a process of grief that you had to go through in grieving the loss of your uterus, of what this might mean for your health, what this might mean for your future, what this might mean for you as Robyn, right?
Yes and no. So I feel like I was largely at peace with what happened. I had almost every nurse, every doctor, so many, and to give this context, like the hospital still remembers 7 years later that day, because it's not common for a woman to need a hysterectomy and lose half her blood after birth, right? And they would walk in, they'd be like, whoa, you're like, are you okay? Like the way that you're coping with this like is not typical. And I think that I grieve more the like experience of not being able to be with Olivia. So I was 2 nights in critical care. She had her ACPA scores were really good, and then she went downhill very rapidly at about 8 p.m. And so she was 5 nights, and then I was stuck to a bed. I had like blood drainage tubes and all sorts, so I literally couldn't get out of bed. And then they were like, oh, like we want to be sure that there's no infection, so you're going to have to, you're not able to visit her. So I visited her only really twice in 5 days. I feel really sad about that still to this day. But in terms of losing my uterus, I feel at peace because I understood what was happening. I know that it was necessary. I have only just stopped feeling clucky for a third baby. And I think that stems, like we had always only planned for 2, trying to have our baby, like Olivia came on the very last embryo that we had. So it was never ever. And like, in all honesty, 2 children is as much as our marriage can handle. Like that's us,
Yeah.
like we're good. And it's only just been now that both of my children are in full time at school that I'm like, oh, freedom is great. But I've been very clucky for the last like 6 years. And I think part of that is potentially like a little bit of unrealized grief around the fact that there was no choice. I've obviously felt I'm super happy that I can wear white pants 365 days a year, but I think I was also very ignorant about what other functions your uterus plays. So I did not know. So for anyone who doesn't understand, like, I don't know, I literally don't know how the male biology works. So I obviously lost all of my uterus and most of my cervix. There's actually only the teeniest part of my cervix left. I still have my fallopian tubes and my ovaries. So I still have, by and large, like the hormones inside are the same. They do suggest, I think, that women who have had a hysterectomy might go into perimenopause a little bit earlier. So I don't understand how that works, but I didn't understand that you have four ligaments, like bungee cords, that keep your uterus in place, and that keeps all of your internal organs in place as well. And it was only years later, after, like, being dismissed by so many doctors, that I discovered I had like a level 2 prolapse. So it was all internal, and it was actually one of my, like, women who had been through my fertility program, that was a woman's physiotherapist. She was like, you've got a prolapse, when we were out at dinner or a function, and I went to see her, and she helped me like really understand what was going on and support me in that. um but yeah, I I feel largely at peace with what happened, because I know that there was no choice. And I was added, I was in a placenta previa group. I was added by somebody else in that group into hysterectomy after childbirth. And it was just heartbreaking, the real grief that many women face when they're in that situation, because they are still expecting to have more children, whereas we had kind of already, we knew deep down inside it probably, like, two was our lot, right? So I think they felt very differently. A lot of women grieve, like, you lose a body part, it's major surgery, and so there is a lot of grief out there. There's possibly something under the surface, but by and large, I feel okay about what happened.
Yeah, and for me, when I lost my first fallopian tube, it was an emergent surgery, right? Like I came into the hospital and it was like, "Hey, by the way, you were pregnant and it's in your fallopian tube and it's too big and we're taking that," right? And I remember in the moment being like, "This has to happen for survival," right? Like
Correct.
otherwise I will
Yes.
rupture and die. And so like it was like, "Yes, do the thing." And for me though, and where I was at, there was no there's no information afterwards. Like the surgeon afterwards was like, "Your other fallopian tube looks fine. You should be have no problems." Like that it was just done, right? But there was no
Yeah.
like really talking through what this meant to lose that fallopian tube or how that ovary without a fallopian tube would work. Like there was no education for me to understand internally what was happening with my body. And instead, I was
Yeah.
just shuffled out and told, like, "It'll be fine, don't worry." And then what
Yeah.
ended up happening is I wasn't okay. Like, we got pregnant again, but then that fallopian tube was failing. And I
Mm.
think for me, the grief really didn't kick in until we were told that we would not be able to get pregnant with my remaining fallopian tube. And then that's when and they were like, "Let's just take it." And I was like, "But now you're taking everything." Like, it was fine when it was one, you didn't explain it, but now this is not okay, right? And so
Yeah.
but you know what? I've heard this from women who've had hysterectomies too, is that when they're given the time, when they're given the right information, the right support, and the safety container to be able to express concerns, to ask the questions, that it takes time to move through thinking about what's about to happen. But on the other side, they do feel peace at the other side because they have the answers, like, they were able to almost in a way workshop it out of, like, "What does this all
Yeah.
mean? What are my options?" And I think, like, that is the key for every woman is us being able to be heard. How often in our life are we silenced
Hmm.
and we just wanna be heard?
And I think that is such an important part. So there needs to be a debrief, like a
Mhm.
really thorough debrief of exactly what happened. And I had a debrief, but I also think that because it was such a shit show, right? for like, I mean, I feel really sorry for Ross. I think Ross probably has a lot of trauma around the birth because he didn't know she'd been born. So he walked into the hospital at 5 p.m. and there was a baby in the corridor, and they were like, here's your baby. You're being admitted to the maternity ward as the carer. And he wasn't even expecting her to be born. And Bhavna was just like, oh, that's Robyn's baby? Like, she didn't even know. But so many women, like, they don't get that debrief opportunity. They like, we need a play by play. Like, what happened exactly? Why wasn't this? We need that play by play. And I think because mine was such a shit show, though, I got that play by play. But I do wish that they had said to me right at the start, you're going to need to see a women's health physio. This is what this is going to look like, etc. And that was very much knowledge that I had to like look at myself, which I think was because they were like fragile, don't touch, like this, like this was an unusual situation, you know. And so
I love that. Now, I'm curious because you did kind of mention this, that like you have your ovaries, so you have your hormones, so that you still in some ways experience the cycle, although you just don't have the markers like the bleed or the ovulation, a significant ovulation for you to be able to like, hey, this is happening. So,
yeah.
how have you been able to still think about your cycle or to, you know, kind of have that cyclical living in some aspect, even if it's not perfect? How have you been able to still incorporate cyclical living without a uterus?
So I love this question. So I always, I guess from my fertility journey, because you become so hyper aware of this is when I'm ovulating, I became really familiar with, like, I was burnt out by basal body temperature tracking at some point. And so I got to the point though where I would recognize other markers, like feeling really energized. You know, this is what's happening with the way that I'm feeling, dealing, coping through life, that I could almost like pinpoint this is when I'm ovulating, like this, knowing just, and even just confidence and like outwardness in my life, in not so much having PMS, like being grumpy, but more so there would be this times, I guess I think it's inner fall, where I would have this like inner critic just come right out, that I could thought to myself, like, I think I have an idea of my cycle because I'm still going through these seasons in my life. And it was funny because there's a fertility tracker called Mira. They reached out for me to be like one of their, I guess, like brand ambassadors. And I thought, let's give it a whirl. Like, let's see if I'm on the money. And I was on the money. And so I was just so, I felt so validated in my knowledge of my body because of that. And very much to me, it's not necessarily like physical symptoms. Like, I obviously wasn't getting, like cramping pain or anything like that. It's literally my energy levels, the way, how social am I feeling? How inward am I feeling? What is my inner critic like? And it was through understanding and knowing, this kind of 28 days of different seasons that I would go through in the way I was thinking, feeling, and coping through life. And it's been really empowering to understand that, which obviously started in my fertility journey, because I guess from a metacognition perspective, I know that I don't always have to believe my brain. So if I'm in that moment of feeling really hypercritical of myself, or if I'm in this space of being like, you know what, right now I need rest, I'm not critical of myself, right? I'm not, the narrative inside my head isn't like, oh my God, you're garbage. It's, oh my gosh, this must be where you are in your cycle right now, right? So it's helped me from that perspective. But even the way that I run my business now, I don't run my business in 24 cycles. Like, it hasn't turned me into a tiny man. I'm a woman.
Yeah.
Right. I'm still run my business through a different lens. I break, a lot of my programs into weeks 1, weeks 2, weeks 3, weeks 4. My programs have rest times in there. And in my business, I run a business that doesn't require, like, so let's say I was doing one-to-one consulting work. It's not 5 sessions 5 days a week, because I know that my life doesn't run like that. There are going to be times when I, as a woman, need to rest. There are going to be times when I feel highly creative and have all of these ideas. So very much my business is broken into, like segments that work really well for me. And I was so proud when I did that mirror test for a couple of months to discover that, yes, like, it's not in my head, the seasons that I experience. It is, like, literally it's me as a woman.
And I think that's so powerful because anyone who's had a hysterectomy or anyone that is postmenopause, this is so impactful for them to hear, of knowing that we have 4 different bodies essentially that we can check in with, right? We have our
Yeah.
physical body, our mental body, our emotional body, and our spiritual body. And our physical body is going to change. We're not going to have those symptoms like you said. Like, I'm not going to have the period cramps or the low back pain or whatever the case might be. But you have those other bodies to check in with, to know how you're cycling, how you're shifting and changing, and that does not leave. It is a memory imprinted in your tissue since your first bleed, right? Like, and so this is just, I think
Yeah.
this is what makes us not just these biological things in skin. We are this multidimensional feminine, like, we are women. We are something different and we operate this way, and we can still utilize that even without a body part. And I think that is so helpful for women to hear. I also want to shout out right now because you kind of wove it in there. So, Robyn is my business coach. And one of the reasons why I worked with her, or decided to work with her, was because of this lens, the lens that you bring of, like, how can we relax at times in our business? How can we, like, really push on the gas? How can we just give ourselves permission to not operate just on the 24-hour circadian rhythm, right? And so, just a little shout out to you. Maybe you can share a little bit about what you do, because you have a few different programs. So,
I do. And I think one of the things that has been especially powerful for me is really looking at what programs I can have that are time leveraged. Because, like I say, there are going to be seasons of rest, there are going to be seasons of creativity, and creating programs, whether that's like strictly an online course or a group program, but having programs that allow the creativity for all of my different seasons, and having the flexibility for me as a woman, as a mother, you know, to be able to, like, flex and go hard at some times of the month and others, is really powerful. So I really speak to, from a business lens, creating a signature framework or a signature program, something that we can become really known for, and then branching off from that and having that as a time leverage program. So I have my own signature program which supports women in creating theirs, and that's called Launch Easy Life. But the way that I love, like, if I could work 24/7 in the Well Conceived Mastermind, I would, because it's a way that I can form really deep relationships with women in a really supportive way that I think we need. So I wouldn't even call it like a business coaching program. It's more a partnership of,
mhm.
how can I support you with the knowledge of, like, spreadsheet nerdy stuff and conversion rates and, like, program data, Facebook ads, all of that, to help you, like, uncover and share with the world the genius that you have. And so I run the Well Conceived Mastermind. It's a really small and intimate, and I think feminine place,
Mhm.
from which we can run our businesses. And it's for women who identify as women only. So it's not for men. So
Yeah.
you can identify in several ways, but just not as a man, because I think that makes it special, because we look at things through the lens of us as deeply feminine beings.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I love the Well Conceived Mastermind. I love having you in it. And I'm say to people, I'm slowly curating a group of just all of my favorite people in online business, that I can work with and support every day.
And I love being part of it. It has been a game changer in really helping me to support me in knowing what I already feel in my body, of being able to be like, okay, Robyn, I don't want to do that right now. I feel like I need to rest. And you're like, yeah, that's your season. So let's just do that. So, and then really helping me to like spearhead when I have the energy. So it's a great program.
Yeah.
So I like to end these calls with a womb-led tip that our listeners can walk away with. So if there is one tip, it could be womb related, it can be just women in business, it can be whatever kind of comes to you, what would be your womb-led tip for anyone listening?
So, along the lines of not having to believe everything that our brain tells us, there are times when, like at various seasons in our lives, when our inner critic is just raging. And so, whenever we have a thought, I like people to pause and be like, hang on, who is saying this to me? And is this how a best friend would speak to me? Because in so many situations in our lives as women, I don't think we give ourselves enough grace to be like just human beings. Like we don't have to aim for perfection. It's totally great to aim for mediocre. But so often when we're not perfect, which is impossible, there's this raging voice inside us. It's like a drill sergeant that's like, you're not good enough, you should be doing better, etc. And I'm always like, you know what, just check in. Like, would you say that to a best friend? If you had a best friend who was like, I'm dropping all the balls, like this isn't working, whatever, who would shout in your face and point in your face and be like, not good enough, give me 20? Or would a best friend be like, you know what, you're incredible, give yourself a minute, like I know that this is going to pan out. How are we talking to ourselves? Because that's the most important relationship that we can have. And it's not even that you have to reframe it with like, no, you're incredible, you're amazing, or anything. You can just be like, oh, is this how a best friend would speak to me? Am I being my own best friend?
I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank you, Robyn, for coming on the podcast today and for sharing your story and sharing all the vulnerable moments in that story. I think sometimes when women can hear the full story, hear the stuff that maybe is not necessarily shared, it can really help us to know that we're seen, we're heard, we are all connected. And so thank you for being raw, vulnerable, and sharing all the stuff. So I love this episode and I loved having you on here. So thank you so much again.
Oh, big thank you for having me. I'm such an open book, so I'm always happy to chat with anyone if they're having their own experience of a hysterectomy. Please reach out. Thank you so much for having me.
Friends, have you had a chance to download my new free ebook? Maybe it's not you. The Truth on PMS and How You Can Take Back Control of Your Cycle is now available. This is truly a book that I think needs to be in the hands of every woman who struggles with the second half of their menstrual cycle. So if this is you, click on the link in the show notes and download your free copy today. And remember to subscribe to this podcast and share a review if you loved this episode. Until next time, remember, womb wisdom equals connection to self, which ultimately equals inspired living.